Today we'll be in Exodus 16 again. And a reminder, last week we saw the provision of Jehovah through the quail and the manna. Just as Moses had declared earlier in the chapter, Jehovah had heard their complaining and was going to provide for them. Last week we saw how Jehovah gave them specific instruction to gather an omer worth of manna for each person. And each person that gathered the amount designated found that they had exactly the right amount to satisfy them. Moses had also given them warning that they were to eat everything that they gathered and leave none of it until the morning. Now, of course, there were some among Israel that did not listen, and those individuals found that the manna brought forth worms, and it stank the next morning for any amounts that were left over. Jehovah was trying to teach his people that they were to look for him for their daily provision, and they could trust that it would come each day for them. There was no reason to ration their portions. They would have enough to be satisfied every day that they obeyed Jehovah and went out and gathered. But they had to gather in the morning after it had appeared, because as soon as the sun waxed hot, the text says that the manna would melt. In other words, they had to collect it in the early morning. Today we'll see the double provision provided on the sixth day to enable Israel to observe the Sabbath. We'll consider the connection between this, and we'll also consider the significance of the Sabbath being discussed here before we get to chapter 20, where the Ten Commandments are given and the command to keep the Sabbath is listed. And so we'll finish that up with that piece of it, and we'll say the last part of chapter 16 for next week. So let's go ahead and let's open up in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the day that you provided for us. Thank you for this book that we continue to work through, the book of Exodus. And here we see the provision you provided for your people related to food as they hungered in the wilderness. Father, you gave them manna, and every day, days 1 through 5, you gave them a portion of an omer to collect, and they were to eat that and not leave it up to the next morning. But on the sixth day, you gave a double portion so that your people would not have to work and go out and labor on your Sabbath. Father, I pray that as we consider the truths of this passage here today, I pray you help us to have clarity and be further strengthened in the instruction to keep your Sabbath and how it was provided as an instruction, not just in the Ten Commandments, but well before, and it was understood by your people that they were to observe it. Father, I pray that you give us understanding as we spend time stepping through your word today, and I pray all this in Yeshua's name. Amen. All right, move to verse 22. We'll pick up where we left off last week. Verse 22 says, "And it came to pass that on the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses." And so what we find here is that 5 days have passed. And on each of the 5 days, the people went out and gathered an omer worth of manna. Now the sixth day has arrived, and the people remember the instruction that Moses gave them. We found that back in verses 4 and 5. So if you go back to the same chapter and look at verse 4, it says, "Then said the Lord unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them, whether they will walk in my law or no. And it shall come to pass that on the sixth day they shall prepare that which they bring in. It shall be twice as much as they gather daily." And so we saw back here that Moses had made the announcement to them. This came from Jehovah. And so Moses would have passed this on to help them understand that on the sixth day they were to gather twice as much manna. And so the first 5 days was a single amount and double portion on the sixth day. So 2 omers on the sixth day for each person. And we can see at the end of verse 22 that the rulers of the congregation came and tell Moses what they observed. So verse 22 again, it says, "And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses." Now we can tell from Moses' response at verse 23 that it's like the rulers, which are the leaders here, are worried about the situation. So let's just quickly take a look at verse 23. We'll come back. We're not going to focus on this, but it says here, "And he said unto them," that be Moses, "This is that which the Lord has said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which you'll bake today, and seethe that which you'll seethe, and that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. And so it seems like the leaders are worried about the situation when they go to Moses at the end of verse 22 and they tell Moses about what they saw. So it seems like it would have been odd that they would also not have received the instruction earlier that the people were to gather twice as much on the sixth day. So it's not like the people were in the loop of what were there to do and the leaders were outside of the knowledge. But it seems what's being implied here is that they were really worried about what was going to happen to all the manna that would be left until the following day. So all the people they're observing here is gathering twice as much. Remember what we read back in verse 19 and 20. It says, "And Moses said, Let no man leave of it until the morning. Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left it until the morning, and it bred worms, and stank, and Moses was wroth with them." And so these leaders, it appears, were worried that this leftover manna would cause a major stink in the camp. And so it's almost like these leaders, these rulers, were operating off of unbelief. It's like they were operating on the fact pattern that they observed, what they could see, what they had seen at this point. Remember, for 5 days, they had gathered a single amount, and anybody that gathered any amount over found that it bred worms and it stank. And so we for sure know that a number of people did it in the first day. And there may be but a few people that still did it in the second day and the third day possibly. And it's like it took the full period of time to realize, wait a second, we need to stop this. And so we find these leaders here, rather than believing the actual words of Jehovah, they were going off of what they could see and what they had experienced up to this point. And so after all they've experienced firsthand is that manna does not last more than 1 day. And this is how a lot of people in the world operate. They base on what they see and what they experience, not necessarily what is written or what is commanded by the Word of God. I mean, a classic example of this is people would say, for example, well, how can we believe the resurrection? How many people have you ever seen raised from the dead? And so when you see instructions in the Bible, the question is, do you believe what God has to say, or do you believe what you've experienced up to this point? And so there's many things we need to take God based on his word, and we need to follow and carry out what he instructs, and not basically what we've learned and what we've experienced all the time. And so we have these leaders here coming to Moses and saying, wait a second, the people have gathered 2 portions of food, of manna, on this 6th day. Are you sure this is really a good idea? I mean, after all, we've experienced negative things when we don't eat it all for the next day. And so they're going off experience. So it seems like they're going to Moses to complain and they're going to complain in their faithlessness. That's what it seems like going on. Moving on to verse 23. "And he, Moses, said unto them, This is that which the Lord has said, Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which you'll bake today, and seethe that which you'll seethe, and that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept unto the morning." Here we see Moses' response to the leaders. Moses starts off his explanation in a matter-of-fact sort of way. He says that tomorrow is the rest of the Sabbath unto Jehovah. It's the rest of the holy Sabbath unto Jehovah. And because of this, Moses says the people are to take what they gathered. And this would be 2 times as much as they had gathered in the first 5 days of the week. And then to prepare the manna however they want to. And it says here in the text that they can bake it, they can seethe it, which means to boil or to roast it. And we saw, last week when we looked at Numbers, we saw that they could grind it or mill it as well. So however they wanted to put it together. So Moses basically says to prepare the manna however they want to on this 6th day. They're supposed to gather twice as much they were to do so, and then to prepare it. But whatever they want to do to prepare it, it needs to be done on that 6th day. So if you're going to bake it on the 6th day. If you're going to seethe it or roast it or boil it, whatever you're going to do with it, you need to do it on that 6th day. And that which is left over of what they prepared, they're to keep it until the morning, which would be the next day. So in other words, if they baked a bunch of bread out of the manna, they could keep some loaves aside for the next day. If they roasted some of it, they could keep some of the roasted manna off until the next day. And so what this is not saying is prepare your portion for today in bread or cakes or whatever it is, and then tomorrow you can bake more or you can seethe more. Basically, it's trying to say is do whatever you can do for preparation today and then carry it over to the next day. In other words, what Moses is saying is the double portion that they collected will not go bad. That's what he's trying to say here in verse 23. So he's assuring him. They're saying, this is that which the Lord has said, tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. He says, bake with that which you'll bake, and seethe what you'll seethe, and that which remaineth over, lay out to be kept until the morning, until the next day. So in other words, it's not going to go bad, which is the extra portion. The people will be able to eat that which is left over the next day. So Moses is trying to say, they're going to be able to eat it. Don't worry about it. This is what they need to do. And we can see here that Moses believes the word of Jehovah. So Moses is operating off of faith here. Has Moses seen that this is going to happen? That it's not going to breed worms? That it's not going to stink? The answer is no. Moses hasn't seen this. He's making this declaration to the leaders based on faith. This is how it's supposed to work. God says to do something, and then we respond in obedience. Jehovah says, I know you may have experienced something before. You may have been told by others this is how something's supposed to work, but you need to rely upon me for your ultimate direction. And this is how we need to order our life as well. We need to respond to what the Bible says in faith and not necessarily based on our experiences of what we can see. And so we've dealt with a number of topics like this, of where we use the Bible as a rule of authority in our direction in our life, and not based on what scientists tell us, or what philosophers tell us, of what sociologists tell us, what the government tells us. Whatever it is, we operate based on what the Bible tells us. And that's how we order our life. Now, this should not have been a stretch for the people. This should have been the people who have been like, wait a second, how do we know we can trust Jehovah? After all, Jehovah performed a miracle for 5 days that defied all logic and practicality that one would experience in the wilderness. And you think about that for a moment. I mean, God rained down bread from heaven. I mean, this bread didn't exist the previous night. And then they wake up in the morning, the dew evaporates, and there's bread there. That defies their experience. When Jehovah said this was going to happen the day before the first time this occurred, it would cause people to say, wait a second. But even that wasn't the first miracle God had done. And so this was clearly a miracle they experienced already with the manna as being a provision from Jehovah. And if Jehovah could do a miracle one way, surely he could adjust the miracle another way if he says it's going to happen a certain way. And so it's not like they're going to say, well, no, Jehovah can only operate the miracle this way. And so that's what the leaders were kind of doing in a way, saying, this is what he told us initially, this is what we experienced, why would we think it's going to change? Well, the reason why, God said that there was going to be a different pattern for the sixth day. Now, what is interesting about the dialogue here in the text is that Moses gives instruction here almost as a form of a rebuke. It's like Moses is saying, this should not surprise you because tomorrow is the Sabbath. So notice how he responds. So we see in verse 22, all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Verse 23, and he said unto them, this is that which the Lord has said, tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. And so he responds to them almost like a form of a rebuke. To basically say is, what's your problem? Tomorrow is the holy Sabbath. And so you should expect Jehovah to be operating this way anyways. It should make sense to you why Jehovah had instructed us earlier to gather twice as much as on the sixth day is what Moses is trying to say to them. Now, most individuals, when they approach the text, make the assumption that Moses is giving the leaders instructions about the Sabbath itself. That the Sabbath was a new concept that Israel needed to learn about. And this is usually the assumption that is read into the text when we get to Exodus 16. But when you read through this slowly, especially this entire section here, you realize that no such impression is given in the text. Moses is not giving a new instruction to say, hey, here's a new thing for you. It's called the Sabbath. The Sabbath happens on the seventh day of the week, and therefore you need to keep it because God says that this is a special day for you to observe. We don't see that when you read through this slowly. So one of the challenges I have for you is if you're struggling with this piece of it, read through this portion of Scripture slowly and ask yourself the question, is Moses really saying here, this is a new thing? Because the text doesn't say that. Rather, it's like Moses is saying they should have already made the connection why twice as much manna is to be gathered and prepared. And so Moses is trying to say is, this should make sense to you. It's the Christian theological baggage that the Sabbath did not come about until the Torah was given that we get this idea that the Sabbath is something new. That we read this idea about the Sabbath being something into the text that's being presented here for the first time. But that's being read into the text. It's not presented here like it's a brand new thing. Rather, the manna being presented as being something new is being presented as being introductory to the Israelites. Now, is this the first time that the entire Bible, the noun Sabbath, appears? Well, the answer is yes. This is the first time we see the word Sabbath in the Bible as far as a noun form. But that doesn't mean that the concept of the Sabbath of rest did not exist. As we covered this a while back, we were dealing with this topic of the Sabbath. But notice the word that Moses uses here. He says in verse 23, he says, tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. And so he says rest of the holy Sabbath. The Hebrew literally reads, tomorrow is the Sabbath of the holy Sabbath unto Jehovah. Now, there's two different forms of the word Sabbath. One is Sabbath and one is Sabbaton. But we see two different words of Sabbath used, but the word Sabbath is a good translation. Now, the word behind Sabbath is the same word that is found in Genesis chapter 2 in verse 2 and 3, but only in the verb form. So if you hold your spot here and go back to Genesis chapter 2, a little bit of a refresher. So Genesis chapter 2, it says here, get up in verse 1, chapter 2, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. Now in both verses 2 and verse 3, we see the word rested. So again, verse 2 says, in the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day. So you see the word rested. Well, the word rested there is the verb form of the word translated as Sabbath in Exodus 16. And then we see the same verb in verse 3. It says, and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested or Sabbathed from all his work which God created and made. So you could translate this as Sabbathed, because it's in the verb form. So he rested. So rested is a good translation. But if they were to translate this Sabbath, I kind of wondered how many more people would get the connection that God was actually instituting the Sabbath pattern back in creation. And that's not something read into the text. Clearly, in Exodus 20, God's going to make the connection as part of the Ten Commandments back to the 7 days of creation. But it shouldn't have come as a surprise that the pattern was established back here. Now also, notice in verse 3 of Genesis chapter 2, it says, and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. So this Sabbath day, he sanctified it. Now this word sanctified is the verb form of the word translated as holy in Exodus 16. And so there's two things that connects Genesis 2 with related to the Sabbath to Exodus 16. One is the verb translated as rested, which is the word Sabbath. And the other thing is this idea of sanctified it. And so God says that he sanctified the seventh day because he Sabbathed in it. And so if you go back to Exodus 16 and go back to verse 23, Exodus 16:23 says, and he said unto them, this is that which the Lord has said, tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. The question becomes, where did God say this? I would argue it was Genesis chapter 2. And so Moses is trying to say, well, this is the day that God said he rested in, he Sabbathed in, that he sanctified it. It is his holy Sabbath. It's his sanctified rest. if you want to use it in the language of Genesis chapter 2. And so we see two words that connect Genesis 2 with Exodus 16. You see, I believe Jehovah's people have always recognized the pattern of the Sabbath established at creation. And I believe this word, this would have been one of the things taught to Adam when Jehovah walked with Adam in the cool of the day. And so when God met with Adam, when God walked with Adam, one of the things that God would have taught him had to do with and was connected with the Sabbath. It's even possible that maybe the day that Jehovah walked with Adam was on the Sabbath. But we see here, I believe, that Jehovah's people would have understood this, and consequently would have been carried down from generation to generation. Now, is that some inferences made in the text? Absolutely, yes, it is. But when you put the text together, the scripture together, this is a reasonable conclusion to gather. And when you get to Exodus 16, this idea of the concept of the Sabbath is not a brand new thing, I don't believe, especially the words that Moses uses here. And so when we get to the days of Moses, Israel knew of and understood this Sabbath concept. Now, whether or not all of Israel faithfully kept it is another story. But whether they understood it, I would argue yes. The text doesn't specifically say how many kept it and whether they kept it at this point or how faithful they were. But when we get here to Exodus 16, the way this is presented is not as if it's something new. And so again, we just realize how Moses presents this. And we spent a lot of words dealing with manna. And then we get to verse 23, when the leaders come to Moses and they say, well, the people are collecting twice as much today. And Moses responds, this is that which the Lord has said, tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. And so he's like, tomorrow is the Sabbath, guys. I mean, don't you get it? Type of a thing. And so when you read through this chapter carefully, nothing indicates otherwise. And this is like a brand new thing. So we're maybe we'll get to just a moment here. We'll get to maybe there's a little bit of ambiguity in one of the verses here, but I'll deal with that fully here in a moment. But in fact, if this was something new, this would be a very odd way of presenting it. It's almost like Moses would be giving much more instruction to say, wait a second, God's doing this because he's giving you a brand new day which is special unto you for his covenant people that you need to keep because it's going to identify you with him, and it's a special thing once a week. And only, by the way, it's really cool because this also connects back to the Sabbath day that he rested on. And so he's going to institute this now. And so there's no instruction like that at all. And so there's nothing that bridges that to be like a new thing that Moses is introducing something, especially when you consider all the instruction about how they're supposed to keep the man in this way. So there's no teaching whatsoever. And I believe what the text is presenting is that Jehovah has molded the provision of the manna around the Sabbath. He's molded this provision of the daily manna on days 1 through 5 and then twice double portion on day 6. He's molded the provision around the Sabbath truth. That Jehovah is trying to teach his people that his provision for his people works with his Sabbath and not against it. That he operates in conjunction and in harmony. All his provisions for his people, all of his instructions for his people work together. And that's what he's trying to help them understand. That from the very beginning of the provision, Jehovah already had a plan worked out so his people could rest on the Sabbath. Also, another thing to consider is that if the Sabbath was meant to be something exclusively connected to the giving of the Torah, if that's what the Sabbath is supposed to be, that this is what I want you to do, and this is what I'm giving you is connection to giving you the Torah, there is absolutely no reason for Jehovah to make an allowance for the Sabbath here. So again, in other words, if God was planning on just giving his people the Sabbath as being connected with the Torah, Mount Sinai, he could have just given his people a ration of manna every single day of the week, all 7 days. And then when he got to the Torah, giving the Torah, and said, hey, by the way, I'm also going to give you the Sabbath now, and I want you to keep it. And so we're going to modify some things here so that you don't have to worry working on the Sabbath. He doesn't do that. He very easily could have done that to highlight the importance of this day. To say, wait a second, all the way up to this point, you've been able to keep every single day the same way. But now I'm going to elevate this new day. And I'm going to show you how to elevate this because I'm going to give you a double portion on the 6th day. And we're going to change things. But he never does that. And so this Sabbath thing is not something new. It was not instituted at Mount Sinai, and it wasn't instituted here. It was already in existence here, and God then now gave the manna provision around the Sabbath to show that the Sabbath is priority and works, and his provisions work with the Sabbath. And think about it for a moment. So that's just something to think about as we're kind of working through this. So what becomes clear is the Sabbath already existed when we get to Exodus 16. And Jehovah's provision of the manna was purposely designated so people could obey the sanctified Sabbath day that was set aside on the 7th day of creation. So it continued up to this point. So this is not something new. And the testimony that we have, the Sabbath, even mentioned before the giving of the Torah, speaks very loudly that the Sabbath is part of Jehovah's design for mankind. And so again, we dealt with this before, but having the Sabbath introduced here in Exodus 16, before the Torah is given, highlights the Sabbath existed before the Torah was at least written down and provided to the people at Mount Sinai. And so we see, as it were, Moses softly rebuking the rulers of the congregation here in verse 23. That it is because of Sabbath unto Jehovah that the people are to gather twice as much manna, and prepared so that it is ready on the Sabbath day. Why? So that people could rest on the Sabbath day. The text does not indicate anything more about the dialogue between Moses and the elders. It's like we get the impression that they just walked away with this new information, or at least with this rebuke, and they received it, waiting to see what would happen. So the rulers walk away to say, okay, well, let's see what happens now, since Moses is so confident that nothing bad is going to happen, which is what leads us into verse 24. It says, and they laid it up till the morning, as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. The text says they laid it up till the morning as Moses bade. The word for bade means commanded. So you could translate this as commanded. So in verse 24, they laid it up till the morning as Moses commanded. So in other words, the people believed Moses when he said that they should gather twice as much in the 6th day, and they further believed him when they said to keep the extra portion that was left over from that which they prepared. So they believed Moses when they followed his instruction here. And what did they find? Well, as it says in verse 24, that the manna did not stink or have any worms in it on the 7th day. So we have a miracle here. Again, so it's very different. So it very, very clearly shows that Jehovah's hand is in all of this. For the people, this is more proof that this manna was from Jehovah. And so maybe some people could have believed, and I think it would be difficult, that somehow they discovered this new phenomenon in the desert, in the wilderness, this manna that appears every morning. But here is very clear that this is from Jehovah. You see, the food here does not operate like any other food, because it spoils about 24 hours later, 5 days a week. This food has an expiration date of 24 hours. But then the expiration date changes to 48 hours on the 6th day of the week. And so what kind of food do you know operates that way? And then as we'll see, it does not appear at all on the 7th day. And so we see the food has appearances on 6 days, but doesn't appear on the 7th day, and it has different expiration days on days 1 through 5 versus day 6. So this food does not operate like anything else that mankind has contact with. And so being from Jehovah is the only way to explain it. And of course, this unique food behavior is tailored specifically to enable Jehovah's people to keep the Sabbath. And so not only does it operate in a way that no other food operates, but it also happens to operate to observe Jehovah's holy, sanctified day of the Sabbath. And so clearly this is connected to Jehovah. There's no other way around it. So Jehovah gets all the credit for it. Moving on to verse 25. And Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today ye shall not find it in the field. Now here we have Moses giving instruction to the people. In this verse, if anyone, potentially has some ambiguity to it. So Moses gives further instruction about the manna that was laid up for the seventh day, that the people found did not stink and it did not bring forth worms. So he tells them to go ahead and eat it. You think about that for a moment, because the people are like, okay, I see it doesn't, I can see there's no worms in it. I can smell there's no problem with it, but can I go ahead and eat it? Maybe this is just still bad, but I can't tell. And so Moses tells them to go ahead and eat it. In other words, he says you can see that it's fine, and you can smell that it's fine, but go ahead. You can trust your senses and go ahead and eat it. In fact, he says, this is the only food you're going to have available to eat today. Again, verse 25. And Moses says, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today ye shall not find it in the field. So in other words, if you don't eat this food, you're not going to find any more food. So this is all you have available to you today. So you need to trust me, and you can eat it. So, because he says you're not going to find any manna in the field. Now what we are finding here is that Moses is basically giving his people play-by-play instructions. First, we find that he tells his people to gather twice as much manna on the sixth day. So that's the only instruction they received. So on the sixth day, you're supposed to gather twice as much. Then, after they gather the food, the manna, he tells them to prepare 2 days' worth of preparation food on the sixth day. So they go ahead and prepare it. Then they're to keep the leftovers until the seventh day. So he tells them, give them that instruction. And then when the morning of the seventh day arrives, they find the manna is perfectly good. Moses then tells them to go ahead and eat it because that is their provision for that day. So he gives them play-by-play instructions or instructions individually every day or every step of the way. In verse 25, Moses also gives the reason for this. He says in verse 25, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Now the way this is phrased in the English, I can see how one could potentially read this as possibly new instruction that Moses is giving here, because there's a little bit of ambiguity here. So when you read verse 25, it says, and Moses says, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. For today you shall not find it in the field. So a person, if you heard someone, if this is all Moses gave for instruction, I can understand a person possibly coming across with saying, well, it sounds a little bit vague here. Maybe Moses, it sounds like, is giving instruction to say, hey, this is a new thing, possibly. So it doesn't say that, but there's a little bit of ambiguity in the structure here, meaning that people were not aware of why they should not gather on the seventh day. It almost sounds like that Moses is giving instruction of why that they would not find anything in the field. But like I said, if you read through this section carefully, this is not how the overall passage reads. Now the first thing to understand, I want to bring some clarity here because I think it's very clear when you read the Hebrew, but the English is a little bit vague. The first thing to understand about this phrase is that we see the word for. So F-O-R. So F-O-R, here's the word for. So the verse 25 says, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. So you see the word F-O-R, for. Now the word for is the Hebrew word ki, which is kaf, kirik, yod. So you have the three letters there, or the two consonants and the vowel. So this is a conjunction that can mean either for or because. So it's a conjunction that's either, you can understand the word for or because. Now conjunctions here, at least in the Hebrew, connect clauses together. Two clauses typically together, sometimes more, but it shows a relationship. In this verse, we have Moses instructing them to eat the manna today. He says, eat this manna today. And then we have two clauses. One is, today is a Sabbath unto Jehovah. And the second clause, today you shall not find it in the field. Now, normally so there are two different types of clauses here. One is a causal clause, and one is a main clause. And so the causal clause helps explain the situation. And when the causal clause appears before the main clause, it's typically translated as the word because. When it's the other way around, it's translated as the word for. And so here, we have the order that typically would translate as the word because. And when it's the opposite, it typically softens the impression of the clause. Now we see the effect of it, for example, if you hold your spot here and turn to Genesis chapter 3. So it's kind of interesting. First we're in Genesis 2, now we're going to be in Genesis 3. And in a moment we'll go to Genesis 4. But take a look at Genesis chapter 3 in verse 14. So we have the whole transgression in the garden and the fall of Adam and Eve and the encounter with the serpent. Take a look at verse 14. It says, "The Lord God said unto the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life." So what we have here is a number of clauses, and one of the clauses is the causal clause, and that is, because thou hast done this. And so you can see this word translated as because is the Hebrew word ki. That's the same word translated as for, F-O-R, in our verse. But notice the strength of this when it's translated as the word because. And you very quickly realize that what Jehovah is saying here to the serpent is because thou hast done this, this is the cause. The effect of it is that you're cursed above all cattle and every beast of the field, and upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And so what he tells us is the relationship is that because he has done this and tempted Eve and caused mankind to sin, that he, the serpent, will be cursed and he'll eat dust the rest of his life and crawl on his belly. And so we see the cause and the effect. And so right away you realize what happened first and what led to the other things. Now when you go back to Exodus chapter 16, if you go back to Exodus chapter 16, this word in verse 25, for, could really be translated as the word because, and it strengthens the phrase. And so Moses says, "Eat that today, because today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today you shall not find it in the field." Now let me show a couple more things here, because so we see this word, if you put the word because there, it strengthens it. And that's typically how it's translated when it's in this order in the Hebrew. So the idea here is that text is indicating because today is a Sabbath, they'll not find any manna in the field. Because it's a Sabbath, they're not going to find any manna in the field. So in other words, the Sabbath is what drives the manna being provided. Another thing that would help us in the understanding here is this translation of a Sabbath. So again, verse 25, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord." So it's almost like Moses, when you read this in the English, is kind of saying, well, you know what, today is considered this thing we're going to call a Sabbath. It's a Sabbath. And so adding the indefinite article or the letter a, it gives the impression this is being a day that's being assigned. However, the word Sabbath in the context is in the context of a Hebrew word for day, which does have the definite article. And so in the verse here, I probably should put this on the board, but we see here how it says the words today. So T-O and then space day. So that's literally in the Hebrew, today is the Hebrew word, it's a one-word Hebrew word with the definite article, the day. And so you could translate it as the day. Oftentimes when this construction is normally understood, it's translated as this day. When it's speaking on a specific day, it reasonably could be understood as today. But consider, for example, in Genesis chapter 4, where you have the exact same construction appear. And just realize that this is how it's typically translated. And so it's kind of interesting how this is presented in Exodus 16. But Genesis 4:14 this time. Genesis 4:14, it says, "Behold, thou hast driven me out," this be Cain, "out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me." So Cain says here, "Behold, thou hast driven me out this day." So the phrase "this day" is the same thing translated as today in Exodus 16. And so why is all this important? So when I start putting this stuff together, let's go back to Exodus 16. When you understand this translation, today is the word day with a definite article, meaning this specific day, we can put the pieces together and we see that this definiteness of the word day is connected to Sabbath. And so Moses is trying to say is this specific day is the Sabbath. And so the reference to Sabbath also has a definiteness to it. And so this can be seen, for example, in verse 26. So we'll come back to this in a moment. But notice as it says here in verse 26, 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. Here, there's no definite article with the word Sabbath either, but they translate it as the Sabbath because it's the same kind of concept. And so, interestingly, they called it a Sabbath in 25 and the Sabbath in 26. But it could be translated the same way in both. And so why did I just go through all of that? So you probably maybe got lost in some of that. The reason is because when we look at verse 25, it's translated in a way that puts ambiguity into what Moses is saying. The question is he trying to help the people learn about the concept of the Sabbath? Or are they receiving an explanation on why there's no manna in the field? So that's the question here. Is he trying to help them learn about the Sabbath? Or is he trying to get them to understand why there's no manna in the field and why God gave them a double portion or provision on the sixth day? The reading here in the English, the ambiguity that's provided in the translation, makes it seem like they're being taught about the concept of the Sabbath. That Moses is trying to say here, here's this new concept I'm trying to help you understand, that God is giving you the double portion of manna on the sixth day so he can teach you about the Sabbath. That's the way it's kind of presented here in the translation. Again, go back to verse 25 and read this. It says, and Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today you shall not find it in the field, meaning the manna. However, if this is translated, this would follow the same methodology elsewhere, like in Genesis 3:14 and Genesis 4:14, it'd be translated like this: eat this today, or eat it this day, because this day is the Sabbath to Jehovah. You will not find it this day in the field. And so that's a different way of translating it, but that's a more literal translation and consistent with some of the syntax and grammar rules that we find elsewhere being employed. So I believe this verse is Moses telling them that the reason there's no man in the field is because it's the Sabbath day. So they're not learning about the Sabbath, rather they're seeing how Jehovah is operating in a manner consistent with the Sabbath. And we'll see this further strengthened in a few verses here. So Jehovah is providing a means for his people to be obedient to follow the Sabbath. So that's what he's trying to do here. And Moses is explaining this, which is emphasized in the next verse. So move on to the next verse here in 26. He says, 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. So here we can see that Moses is relaying the command from Jehovah about Sabbath observance. 6 days Israel is to gather the manna. But on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, there will be no manna. The reason is because they should be doing no work on the Sabbath. That's what Moses is trying to explain here. You're supposed to do work on the 6 days, and Jehovah's made it so you don't need to do work on the seventh day because it's his Sabbath day. Verse 27, and it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. So even though Moses had given the instruction, 6 days you shall gather, but the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, you're not going to find any, we still find people going out and trying to gather manna. A portion of people went out and tried to gather on the Sabbath. And then what happens? Well, as it says here in the text, they don't find any manna. So again, verse 27, it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. So some people go out, they go out looking for manna, and they don't find any, just like Moses said would be the case. Now the question becomes, why did they go out? Did they want to find out and verify the word of Moses to prove he was telling the truth? So they could prove it, that yes, Moses, you're right. I'm going to prove you out. That's not the reason why here, though, because it says in verse 27 that they went out to gather. So this tells us the purpose. They didn't go out to prove Moses right. They went out to gather to find food. So again, read the text carefully. It says, then there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather. So the purpose that they went out on the seventh day is they went out to gather manna to eat. In other words, one of three things happened here. First, one of them is that they only gathered one omer on the sixth day, expecting the pattern to continue. So that's one possibility. So some people that went out and to gather more food, more manna on the seventh day, is maybe some of them only gathered one omer of food in the sixth day. Or a second scenario is they gathered more than one omer, but not quite 2 omers, and so they needed more manna. So maybe they didn't completely obey what Jehovah had commanded. Or a third scenario is they gathered 2 omers like they're supposed to, but they didn't lay it aside until the morning. In other words, they threw it out or they got rid of it somehow. So one of those 3 scenarios are possible here, and why some of the individuals went out on the seventh day to gather manna. But no matter which scenario it doesn't matter, because there are people which did not follow the instruction to prepare for the Sabbath. Some people here went out to gather because they didn't obey, they didn't believe. These very likely could have been the same people that left some of the previous day's manna until the next morning on days 1 through 5 and found it as stank and bred worms. So it could have been some of the same people that were just a little slow to follow, a little slow to believe. Some commentators think it may even have been the rulers of the congregation from verse 22 that came to Moses and said and told Moses that people were gathering twice as much food or twice as much manna on the sixth day. So it's almost like the impression was these leaders weren't doing it. But the theme that is developing is there's some within the congregation that are believing and applying the commands that Moses is relaying from Jehovah, and there are others that are not applying the commands as is instructed. So we see here a group of people that's showing themselves not to be obedient. And that which leads us into verse 28. 28 says, "And the Lord said unto Moses, How long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws?" So here we see the rebuke of Jehovah to Moses on behalf of the people that were disobedient. It is clear Jehovah is getting frustrated with Israel's disobedience. That Jehovah is getting frustrated with this aspect of their disobedience. Now keep in mind here, he's been long suffering about their complaining. And they're going to complain further later on here, and he's still not going to rebuke them for it. But here he's rebuking them not for their complaining, he's rebuking them for refusing to keep his commandments and his laws. Again, verse 28, "And the Lord said unto Moses, How long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws?" Jehovah says that Israel has developed a pattern of not keeping his commandments and his laws. Now, the word behind laws is the word Torahs. So what's being said here is that Israel has been breaking his commandments and his laws for some period of time. Now ask yourself a question here. What commands and laws has Israel broken up to this point? Think back in the text here. What laws and what commandments has the people broken that God says, "How long refuse you to keep my commandments and laws?" Because what God's saying here is that this is not the first time. That there's a pattern that he's getting frustrated with. Maybe a better way of asking this is, what commandments and laws has he given thus far in the narrative? The only direct ones that we've seen given, which some have directly disobeyed, was not leaving any manna until the next morning. That's the only command we've seen thus far. All the way from leaving Egypt. Think about this. What commands has he given? The only command he's given so far is don't leave any of it until the morning. And maybe gathering twice as much on the first day, or only gathering one omer on the first. So that's the only commands we have so far. So if Jehovah is frustrated at this point with those commands, that command only existed for 6 days. And Jehovah being long-suffering as he is, it kind of seems a little out of character for him to get frustrated after only 6 days of disobedience on some of these infractions here. And so we see here in verse 28 is a rebuke that is more than 6 days in the making, I believe. What this verse is telling us is that Israel has had a certain degree of knowledge about the commandments and the laws of Jehovah at this point. That's what this is telling us, is that Israel had some knowledge of other commandments and other Torahs up to this point, including, I would argue, knowledge of the Sabbath. And up to this point, they had not been doing a very good job of keeping these commandments and laws that they understood. That's what Jehovah is complaining about here. How long do you refuse to keep the Torahs and the commandments that you know about? Does that mean that they understood the whole Torah? I would say not. I believe because there's clarification in the Torah that didn't exist previously. So Jehovah was giving additional instruction with the Torah on Mount Sinai, but I believe there's aspects that they already would have had in place and knowledge of, including the Sabbath. And now that Jehovah has revealed himself personally to them, they've had this knowledge of his commandments and laws, and now Jehovah reveals himself to his people that had this knowledge. And Jehovah has redeemed his people. And Jehovah has led this people. And Jehovah has given them provisions and the means to obey his commandments, specifically the Sabbath. And so Jehovah expected his people to get the concept they should be following these commandments. So it's not like they have this a scenario of, well, yeah, Jehovah, he's given these commandments in the past, but we don't really know him. He hasn't really done anything for us. Why should we keep his ways? Why should we keep his statutes? Well, Jehovah now has revealed himself to them. He's now redeemed them. He's now given them provision to say, you can do this and keep my commandments. And they don't do it. And so now I think this makes a little more sense in the context of why Jehovah would say, how long refuse you to keep my commandments and Torahs? He says this because they've had knowledge of this, and he's revealed himself to be the God that's redeemed them, and to say, why don't you follow what I tell you to do? I've made a special provision for you to be able to obey them. They should have obeyed the God that redeemed them. And thus Jehovah here is expressing frustration that there are Israelites that refuse to keep his commandments and his laws. This phrase here demonstrates that Israel had knowledge of Jehovah's commandments and Torah ahead of Mount Sinai. This is further evidence of this. There's other places you can go prior to this to get this understanding. And so we've already looked at where he's used the word Torah earlier in their journey to Mount Sinai. And so this is not referring to simple commands of turn here, turn left, stop, and camp here, go, follow the cloud, stop. That's not what this is referring to here when it says, how long you refuse to keep my commandments. Or I believe is it limited the instructions to gather only in Omer manner on days 1 through 5, and twice as much on day 6, and not to leave it up to the next morning except for on day 6 going into day 7. Jehovah was expecting his people to take seriously the commands that they already knew existed. And so as we see here in verse 28 when Jehovah rebukes them for this. Verse 29. See, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath. Therefore he giveth you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Abide ye every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. Now, if you're unclear about verse 25 and what verse 25 meant, so go back to verse 25. And Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today you shall not find it in the field. If this ambiguity in the translation confuses you to try to say, well, maybe this was a new thing that Moses was trying to teach them about, even though there's really little instruction going on here about that. It's more about the manna provision. When you get to verse 29, it's very clear what is being said here. Verse 29, see, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath. Therefore he giveth you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Abide ye every man in his place, let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. And so, if you're unclear, verse 25, 29 here helps. This verse should provide the clarification because this tells us that because Jehovah had given the Sabbath, he provided 2 days worth of manna on the 6th day. Notice the different verb tenses that comes through with the English word give, G-I-V-E. So notice in the first phrase there, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath. So we see the words hath given. That comes from the English, from the same Hebrew word translated as give, Nathan. Also, we see in the second phrase there, or clause, therefore he giveth you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Here you see it translated as giveth. So we see hath given, and we see giveth. And so Jehovah hath given in the past the Sabbath, is what this is saying. Therefore he giveth you now 2 days of bread on the 6th day. So the way this has been translated is a good translation of 2 different verb forms from the Hebrew. So in the Hebrew, these are different verb forms. Same Hebrew verb, but different forms. That gives the understanding that comes through in the text. So usually when you see a TH in the Bible, it has the idea of a present tense. And it's actually a participle in the Hebrew form. And usually when you see like hath given, it refers to something in the past. And so this is a good translation. So again, if I give some helping words here and kind of expound on the verb tenses here, or forms, it says see or understand is what this word see is ra'ah. Understand or perceive that for that the Lord hath given you in the past the Sabbath. Therefore, today he gives you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. And so that's what he's trying to say. So this tells us that the Sabbath was already given in the past. That's what this verse is telling us. When? Well, I would say not in the 6 days before this. It's not Moses isn't saying on the 7th day, 6 days before God gave you the Sabbath. No, he's referring back to the 7th day of creation. And so he's saying he's given you in the past this 7th day, this day that's holy, that's sanctified on the day of creation. And therefore, now, as part of Jehovah's provision for bread for his people, he's provided a double portion on the 6th day for his people so they can keep his Sabbath as was meant to be kept. That's what he's trying to say here, which means not doing any work on the 7th day. So again, verse 29, see, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath. Therefore, because of this, for this reason, he giveth you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. So he's given you 2 days of bread on the 6th day because he already gave you the Sabbath in the past. That's what he's trying to say. So we can see the instruction that every man is to follow this. And he goes so far as to say here that every man is to abide in his place and not go out of his place on the 7th day. Now, before you get the idea of understanding that, well, maybe this is instruction that we're not supposed to leave our houses on the Sabbath. We're supposed to stay within our buildings that we typically dwell in. It's important to understand that this does not mean that people are supposed to not leave their homes on the Sabbath. We have plenty of examples of people outside their homes on the Sabbath out and about throughout the Scripture. So we're not going to go there, but including the Gospels. And so Yeshua was even out with his disciples on the Sabbath a number of occasions. So for example, think about the time that they're out in the field and they gather some of the grain and they're rebuked for doing so. So they're obviously not in their houses on the Sabbath day. And so this is not meant to say that you're not supposed to leave your house here at all. And so this is a reference, rather, instead that the people were not to go out into the fields to gather manna. That's what this is getting at. It's not to go out in the field to gather manna and do work on this day. Rather, they're to stay in the camp and they're to rest. That's what Moses is trying to say here when he says, abide ye every man in his place, let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. Verse 30. So the people rested on the 7th day. You almost get like a sigh of relief. Finally, they did it. And so we see the conclusion of the matter right here. After all the drama, if you want to call it that, leading up to this point, Israel understands that Jehovah wants them to rest on the 7th day. That God gave them the Sabbath for them to rest. And so what does Israel do? They finally rest on the 7th day. That Jehovah has made it so they have no excuse but to rest. And so Israel rested on the 7th day. Now we get to this point, and it feels like it should not have been this difficult to understand and follow. And because we went through a lot of verses here, and it's almost like, well, okay, duh, why did you just observe the Sabbath? But I think we all have a lot to understand and to apply to our own obedience to the Sabbath. I mean, all of us, I think, struggle. This is still new to many of us here as far as how we try to make sure we're observing this and keeping this. Many times we simply overcomplicate the Sabbath. And we overthink about what can we do, can we not do. But the reality is, and this is what comes through very strongly here in Exodus 16, is that Jehovah simply wants his people to rest. He wants them to rest on the Sabbath. He's like, I gave you the provision of the Sabbath, and then you needed food, and I wanted to give you your daily provision, but I want you to understand that you need to still rest on the Sabbath. I'm going to provide for you every day, but I want you to rest on the Sabbath. Just rest. It's not hard. It's not difficult. And so we, here in the 21st century, still struggle with this concept of should we rest or not? God has given us this day, the Sabbath, we're here today, worshiping and honoring him, to enjoy him and the fellowship of his people. That's what he wants. He wants us to rest. And so I think there's a challenge for us here. Let's just keep this day simple. Yes, we're supposed to worship God. Yes, he wants us to meet with him. Yes, he wants his people to gather together. But he wants us to remain in obedience to him by resting as he commands. It's a blessing. This is what Jehovah wants. He wants us to rest on a Sabbath. He's given us the pattern on the seventh day of creation. He reminds his people here through the provision of the manna that he's given the Sabbath, and therefore he gave the double portion the sixth day. Let us do our preparation on the sixth day and prepare so that we can rest as much as possible on the seventh day, as he's instructed, as he's commanded. And as you can see here, as we saw that the Lord rebuked him and says, how long refuse you to keep my commandments and laws? We don't want the Lord to be looking upon us and saying, Graft a Branch Church, why is it so difficult for you to rest on my day I provided for you? So let us be challenged with that and rest. Rejoice, celebrate with the Lord on his Sabbath. Let's pray. Heavenly Father,